All right, everybody, let's begin. So any questions specifically about the class? Like when things are due, access to materials, or it's all working out? Have you been able to access those chapters from Benjamin Madley, that Happy Camp born professor who's now at UCLA? Aren't those
I read
powerful?
the Indians in 18 or before 18 something. I read most of that chapter except for 2 pages, so it's accessible.
Isn't that powerful?
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I mean, all the when he started going through all the abuse essentially that took place, and then all the diseases that took place, it was pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it's one of the most comprehensive looks at the Native Americans before 1846 done by a historian. So it is a groundbreaking book, and he seems to present it in a really thorough way, and he looks at various different Native American groups. But what I love personally is he focuses specifically on groups in our backyard, doesn't he?
Yeah, he even mentioned. I'm guessing that was Reading, or the Reading that he was talking about. The reading he mentioned. I'm guessing that was our Reading, right?
Yeah, same guy, Pearson B. Reading, one of the founders of the city of Reading. He's in that chapter, right?
Yeah, he mentioned my name. He said he was from like Louisiana, and then
Mhm.
he talked about how he compared the Native Americans to basically the slaves, the black slaves of the South.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the way many looked at them. And there are a lot of parallels between how early enslavement of Native Americans here in California directly paralleled what was going on with African Americans elsewhere. So here's the chapter, California Indians before 1846. And then I've also assigned chapter 2 of his. Where is it? Oh, it's somewhere here. Didn't I assign chapter 2 somewhere, everybody? There it is. Right, Prelude to Genocide. And about 3 pages into this chapter 2 of Benjamin Madley, you're all going to read about an early 1846 massacre that happened right on the Sacramento River that I really want to work with others to get some sort of commemoration plaque or something so we remember it together. Okay. But I'm going to scroll. Oh, you all get to watch a movie that's pretty decent. It's a pretty decent American Spirit, American Experience, the company that makes these documentaries. They do a good job. They interview the top historians in the field. They do some historical drama stuff that makes it a little more interesting than just talking heads. And I really enjoy the film. So this talks about the Texas borderlands in the mid 1800s, and there's corresponding 6 questions that go with it. And it's available through Shasta College's live streaming video database. And you can click here to access it. And again, if any of y'all have any access problems, let me know. So today, what we're going to cover is the Mexican-American War. All right. And as I tend to do, what do you all have in your heads coming to the table about the Mexican-American War? What have you all picked up in your young lives?
Wasn't it the thing that started Hidalgo or the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty?
Exactly, and you might
Like they were trying to push towards the west. I know it has to do with Texas, and they tried to buy it, I think, but the Mexicans said no, or Texas said no. Somebody said no.
Yep, you're
And
right. President Polk in the 1840s offered Mexico $30 million to buy most of what is today the Western U.S. Mexico said nope. Good, exactly.
yeah,
Anybody
there we go.
else?
And they had already done the Louisiana Purchase, right? So they had east, and they wanted more land to go west.
Yep, we wanted a country from sea to shining sea. Many Americans did. You're exactly right. But with it came a lot of tumult and stress between should the Western territories become slave states or free states? That's going to be one of my sub themes in this talk. Anything else? Mexican American War. There's no like movies or TV series or manifestations in popular culture. I'm surprised.
To Mexico having to cede about half its territory to the U.S.
Yeah. Oh, and Mexicans still to this day, it's an open wound to many Mexicans still to this day.
Wasn't it like Arizona, Texas, and California? Like I grew up in Southern California, so Mexican-American War, like the missions, that's like a huge thing down there.
Yeah, and many Mexican Americans say we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? That's like one of the
Yeah.
pictures you see down in East LA and elsewhere.
And wasn't there the huge General Santa Anna that he got exiled to Cuba and then didn't he come back and he was actually on the US side but became the president of Mexico or something like that and like gave up Mexico to the US? I don't know.
Yeah, you're going to learn a little bit about General Santa Anna, who's a enigmatic figure in Mexican history. He was president 11 different times in Mexico. One time for 20 minutes. Whoa, it just shows you, and I'm going to dig into it now. It shows you the theme of that is that Mexico was in political chaos. Okay, so let's roll. Let's go to share screen. So here are the questions that I'll be dealing with here. First of all, I'm just going to do a brief overview of who were legal Americans in the 1800s and who were considered legal Mexicans at this time. I'm bringing this up because the issue of legality is front and center in our politics today. Who is a legal American? What does it take, right? There's forces trying to limit who legally can become an American. And we'll briefly compare that with who's a legal Mexican in the 1800s, just for some backdrop. And I know a couple of you might want to be immigration lawyers, so you might all be interested in this. This question, what strikes you about the difference between Mexico and the US leading up to the war? So what I'm going to do is look at a couple separate factors that explain why, well, of course the US whipped Mexico in this war because of A, B, and C. And I will go over the A, B, and C issues. And finally, what was the promise made to Mexican Americans in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, and was this promise kept? Well, if you all have reviewed the California Gold Rush lectures already, you know the promise was not kept. So this final portion of this question, you'll be answering after you watch the Texas, Remember the Alamo film, and the California lectures. So the first Mexican Constitution, Mexico earned its independence from Spain in the 1820s. And previously in New Spain, as you remember from reading Jeffrey Pilcher and others, you were legally a Creole or a person of Spanish descent, and that gave you legal entitlements to jobs and what have you. You paid less taxes. You could also be, during the colonial era, a legal Indian, right, which gave you certain protections, but also you had to pay taxes and serve the Spanish population. And there was this nebulous group in the middle called mestizos, who really didn't have a legal place in the colonial New Spanish political system. So what Mexican politicians did in the 1820s in their constitution was got rid of all distinction. Everybody was now considered a Mexican. And while this sound all well and good on paper, and this is the joke about Mexican laws in general. If you read the current Mexican constitution, you think like, oh my gosh, Mexicans live in frickin' a paradise. Well, it's one thing to have the laws on paper, it's another thing to execute the laws, right, and enforce them. And that's the big divide in much of the world, but Mexico, specifically what I'm talking about here. And in 1829, Mexico abolished slavery. This is going to be an important data point for when you watch the Remembering the Alamo video on Texas. However, if you don't look at it in a legalistic way and just look at it through ethnography or in a more anthropological way, and took a snapshot of Mexicans in the 1840s, there were about 1 million who were of Spanish descent. Some of them recent migrants, but the vast majority of the rest of the 6 million people living were some sort of mixture of all these different peoples. The umbrella term is mestizos. They were mixed from indigenous roots and Afro-Mexican roots as well. So the majority of Mexicans still to this day are a mixture of many, many different peoples from Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Where did most Mexicans live? Well, most Mexicans lived right in the center area here, as we discussed before. And between 70 and 100,000 Mexicans lived up here in what will become the United States. And this includes everything from Texas to California, to Utah to New Mexico, the big northern area. So it was sparsely populated. Nevertheless, 100,000 people is 100,000 people. There were Mexicans living up here. Who was a legal American in the 1800s? If you took a snapshot of the United States in the 1800s before the Civil War, who enjoyed full constitutional rights in America?
White men, generally speaking.
Yeah, white property owning men. Yeah. Women couldn't vote. African Americans were still considered 3/5 of a person just for population count. Of course, they couldn't vote or weren't protected with any rights. Native Americans were not even counted. They were not even counted in the census or anything. Thank you, Justin. So our second constitution was the Constitution of 1787, the one we still live under. Full citizenship was enjoyed by white property owning males, okay? And as much as I sound like I'm critiquing this, I am, this is a lot more than many areas of Western Europe and the world at this time, okay? A lot more rights and privileges were afforded white property owning males in this country compared to other places. This is fascinating. It might be a little out of chronological sync, but can you make this out? Where did the largest number of migrants to the British colonies, what will become America, where did they come from? Can you see those tiny little writings? What's the #1 source of American migrants?
Ireland?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100,000 Irish people came. How many of you have Irish descent? See, yep, got the heck out of there. But what's even above Ireland? What's the word above Ireland? Ireland.
African slaves.
Yeah, enslaved Africans were the #1 source of quote unquote migration because no African said, hey, honey, grab the kids, let's get on a ship and go to Georgia, right? No, right? They were enslaved and brought over, all 278,400, give or take. So I just wanted to point this out, right? And right before the United States became a country, the 100 years or so before, the largest influx of migrants were from Africa. However, there were peoples from other places. So the United States earned its independence in the late 1700s. And one of the first laws passed by the first Congress of the United States, this is something for you future immigration lawyers. So one of the first laws was called the Naturalization Act of 1790. And in it, it said, right, George Washington was the president, John Adams was the vice president, right? These are our founding fathers. I'm going to read the fuzzy script at the bottom. It said, Section 1, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. Whoa, so who is a free white person? That's a serious question. It might seem like, geez, Rodriguez, what does it mean?
Well, it has been always even I'm pretty sure at the time it was kind of considered kind of ambiguous terminology because people we'd consider white today weren't necessarily considered white.
Yeah, like Italians, right? When Italians start to migrate here in numbers in the late 1800s, it took a long time, not as long as other folks, to earn their whiteness, right, in order to be legally accepted and earn their citizenship. These Italians were darker skin and they were Catholic. That was the big thing. There was an anti-Irish prejudice. Many Irish were not considered white because they were Catholic. All right, so white is, like you said, this nebulous, fuzzy word put on certain folks. During World War I, German Americans kind of lost their whiteness because we were at war with them, lost their privilege. But it's pretty clear that, yeah, the first Naturalization Act was a straight up, limited who could come to the United States. When we talk about the 1921 and 24 Immigration Acts, it's going to harken back to this one and try to limit migration down to just people from Northern Europe.
Yeah, I remember reading about this thing in the early 1900s where, for instance, a Japanese immigrant tried to argue that he was considered white because he had light skin, which is another reason that this is a very hard thing to define.
It is, because it's totally made up. White is a total made up thing. If you went to Europe at the time and rolled down London Street and said, hey, you're a white guy, huh? I'd say, no, sir, I'm from London. Or more specifically, I'm from the south of London, and we don't like you people from the north of London. So the term white, black, and brown is a total made up social construct in our country to, right, keep hierarchies alive. All right. And please don't believe me, press me on it. So if you took a snapshot of the United States had more than double the population of Mexico by 1840. About 15 million people were quote unquote whites. And there was about 2.4 million enslaved blacks, and mostly, of course, in the southern part of the country down here. Indians don't count. Remember, they're not even counted in the census until the early 1900s. What were Indians considered? Because Native Americans, just like that Japanese American fellow that Lee mentioned, Native Americans consistently went to court to say, hey, we have the rights here. We were here first. This is our land. We want legal rights in America. So in 1831, one of their cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. This one Cherokee guy named McIntosh, if you want to look it up, went to the Supreme Court and argued that, hey, aren't we Americans too, or shouldn't we be protected? And the Supreme Court under John Marshall, and you can look up John Marshall, he's basically the inventor of the modern Supreme Court. By the way, there's hardly anything in the US Constitution about the Supreme Court. This might be very interesting given our current situation in which we're discussing the Supreme Court quite a bit. There's hardly anything in here about the Supreme Court. Most of it was created by the first Chief Justice, John Marshall. So in 1831, they were ruled domestic dependent nations. What does that mean? If you're a person who's a domestic dependent nation? Oh, and Yadira, with your with job and everything, this probably is pretty interesting and something that's hotly debated amongst folks. What do you think that means?
I'd say at the end of the day, it means that you're considered a foreign country when it's convenient to the country in power, and a subject of them when it's also convenient to.
I think, do you all agree with Lee's cynical analysis? Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's written in such a fuzzy way where, depending on the political circumstances, you can interpret it either way. Exactly. Lee, you're going to be a good lawyer. You're going to be a good lawyer. Fast forward to after the Civil War, and this is something we're going to be talking about with current migration issues. Many folks in the United States who want to limit migration of people in the United States want to get rid of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was passed after the US Civil War, after this nasty war that killed 1 million Americans. And this was the amendment to ensure that African Americans were citizens. So it says, all persons born or naturalized in the US are citizens of the US and of the state wherein they reside. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. So boom, now African Americans are persons, right? They're not 3/5 of a person, and they have rights, at least on paper. Again, at least on paper. It took a long, long time, and many say African Americans still don't have these rights full stop, but that's a matter for a current discussion. Okay, I'm gonna flip the page now. Any questions on any questions or comments about what we just discussed? Oh, hello, Monique.
So you're saying that with the 14th Amendment, that made African Americans citizens, not necessarily them at the time, but their offsprings.
If African Americans were, because it had been about 20, 30 years since the last importation of Africans as slaves to the United States.
Mhm.
So 99% of all the African Americans living in the US at this time were born here.
Oh, okay. Okay,
Yep.
that makes.
Good question. Any other questions or comments? All right, you future lawyers, I love it. And history teachers, Rachel. Rachel, did you get the thing I sent you about the history degree?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Okay, let's look. So my bigger question is, how did the US just whoop Mexico in the Mexican-American War? Well, let's look at infrastructure, okay? So Mexico was a brand new nation in the 1820s after they kicked out Spain. They inherited this huge landmass. Only Russia, China, Britain, and Brazil were larger. When I say Britain, not the little island of Britain, but the United Kingdom, their empire. So this is a huge landmass, very hard to govern. And the focus we have in the borderlands is a very dispersed and independent, fiercely independent, far northern territory. Just like we imagine Western migrants in the United States loving their liberty and their independence and not really wanting to hear what Washington, D.C. has to say. Just like General Mariano Vallejo in California, many Mexicans living up here had little regard for far off Mexico City, who they thought ignored them, and oftentimes they were ignored. So instant country, big, huge, ungovernable territory. On the other hand, the United States in 1870s was most Americans lived on the coast when the United States was born in the 1780s. And to boil down this complex process, the US moved west, right, with settlers, with soldiers and others, and slowly negotiated or conquered various Native American peoples on their western border. Right, this is a long, complex process in which treaties were signed with Native peoples and then ignored. Also, treaties were signed with European nations, for example, with Spain over here, or France in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. So my larger point is that the young United States nation moved slowly and purposefully from east to west. Okay. Let's look at Mexican geography and infrastructure. What strikes you about the geographic map of Mexico right here? If you can see it. I don't know how well you can see this. This is a topographical map, topographical. There's your word of the day.
It almost looks like mountains.
Yeah, it's mountains, mountains, mountains. So thank you. And was that Ashley? Good to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good
I
to
finally found the mute button on here.
It's all right. Hey, you're hanging tough. You can multitask, Ashley. I cannot. Yeah, well, even Hernan Cortez, after he returned to Spain, after invading the Aztecs hinterland here, the King of Spain asked Hernan Cortez, how do you describe Mexico? Hernan Cortez took a big piece of paper, wadded it up and put it on the table. And he just said, sir, it's full of mountains. And it just so happens that the rich highland areas where it's friendly to live and it's not these hot, humid, fetid swamps. I have family members who live in Veracruz and it is nasty, swamp, humid Gulf City. I don't like it. Most of Mexico are mountainous, very mountainous, right? And most of the people live in these inland plains that are very rich. Let me show you. If you go inland to Mexico, there's these highland plains. Mexico City is at 7,000 feet, for example. So it's a lot more temperate, which means it's not as hot, it's not as humid, and it's very rich agriculturally. This is where most native Mexicans lived as well. However, these towns in the center of Mexico, let me just show you, people live right in this part here. The problem is it's very far from the coast and there's no cool big rivers. Like the United States has all these rivers, the Potomac River, the Hudson River, the Mississippi River, in order to easily transport stuff. How's this going to hurt Mexico, that where everybody lives is inland and far away from the coast? Any takers? Monique, Ashley, Rachel, Lee, or Yadira?
It's hard to, and back in those days, before instant transportation, it's kind of hard to, enforce laws from a federal government.
Heck yeah, so that's why you get extreme regionalism in Mexico. So in Mexico, the problem they're going to have in the revolution, and even today, right? Even the drug lords today control central pockets of Mexico because this long history of just isolation from the center of Mexico City. Very good. And you can look at the revolution, or even many say in Mexico is going through a revolution now with the whole narco politics they have going. What this extremely mountainous topography and lack of river transport also created in Mexico was very expensive transportation. The number one way to get stuff moved around, and still a large part today kind of, is through mule train, right? You get a pack of mules and you just muleteers ran the hood. This is why the future General Santa Anna was a former muleteer, somebody who ran these mule trains. Many people in power in Mexico from the ground up, meaning like folks who weren't as rich, who became rich, were muleteers because they were able to travel the countryside, get to know people, make connections, and what have you. However, nevertheless, for our purposes, during the rainy season, many of these steep trails and roads became impassable. In the 1850s, Mexico had 0 canals, 0 trains. You could trade things faster during the Mexica time than you could in the 1850s Mexico. Another data point for explaining why the US was able to whip Mexico so fast during the Mexican-American War was that Mexico only had 2 ports in which you were legally allowed to trade. This goes back to the Spanish Empire trying to control everything. And when you try to control everything, things don't work. Do any of you all have a boss that tries to micromanage everything? No? Yeah? Right? It doesn't work that way, right? You cannot micromanage. The Spanish authorities tried to micromanage Mexican trade, and so they could only use this port over here in Veracruz or Acapulco. And what this led to is a massive black market trade and a lot of corruption too. So, and this also got in the way of Mexico thriving with imports and exports. And a final look at Mexican infrastructure is that during the Mexican Wars of Independence, which lasted over a decade, their wars of independence with Spain, unlike the United States, it was a lot bloodier, it lasted a lot longer. I'm not discounting any of the violence or bloodshed of the US War of Independence with England, but relatively speaking, the Mexican was a lot more destructive in human cost and in infrastructure destruction. The mines were flooded, and some of these silver mines that were flooded by whoever sides didn't control it, didn't actually get up into operation until the 1870s, some 50 years later. After the War of Independence, Mexico's economy was cut in half and they didn't recover until the 1870s. So because of these series of wars that happened in Mexico, their infrastructure was literally destroyed for 50 years after. Compared to the US, has anybody traveled to the East Coast at all? Anywhere out there? Where'd you go, Lee?
When I was a kid, I went to Washington, D.C.,
yeah.
Baltimore,
Yeah, right.
around there.
How do you describe, or even looking at a map, what strikes you about the eastern United States topography, if you can make that out?
You got to get through the Appalachians to get there.
Yeah, there's this relatively small mountain range here, but still most people lived right on the coast and then over here in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. But how is this different than central Mexico where people live down here?
All the big cities are very close together.
Yeah, concentrated population, and all these have waterways, and these are very chill rivers, right? Sure, some of them have rapids, but oh my gosh, when you have rapids, look what the United States did, build something like the Erie Canal. In the Erie Canal, many Americans teased the New York governor and other people who are investing in it, saying it's your big ditch. And there were a lot of German Americans. German Americans at this time were the folks fresh off the boat who died building this canal. So it came at a huge price, but it ended up causing our economy to explode. Because what the Erie Canal did, if you can see it, it's this one right across here, a man-made ditch that connected the Atlantic Ocean with basically Chicago, because you could use all these waterways. So in other words, the Midwest of the United States was connected to the Atlantic Ocean of the United States with this canal. And I know this map has a lot of confusing words and things, but my main point is that, here's another way to look at it. The Erie Canal's right here. In other words, all these waterways in the Midwest, what's today Ohio and all of that, are connected to all these people living on the East. So by 1825, the United States had constructed 3,700 miles of canals. And when you think about it, a canal is such an easy way to transport something because it's a big, flat body of water. And you see how you have the horses on the left? And you just connect it to the horses if you're going upstream. And rather easily, the horses or whomever, whatever beast of burden, can pull you upstream. Ooh. Any questions about US infrastructure compared to Mexican infrastructure? Does that make sense? Yeah, for topographical reasons and others, the Mexico had zero infrastructure compared to us. And this is another reason why the United States was able to move soldiers and goods a lot faster. All right, welcome back, Yadira. Let's talk about politics. Until the Civil War, always until the Civil War, because that's when the United States just blew up literally, the US political situation was relatively stable. We only went through 9 presidents, and there was always a peaceful transfer of power from 1810 to 1860. For example, here's President Polk. President Polk is the one who presided over the US during the Mexican-American War. However, what wasn't so stable, something was simmering right, not even below the surface, something that was simmering at the surface, and everybody was scared it was just going to explode, and it did in 1860, was as the United States, as Americans settle further west, what is going to happen? Are these states, territories that become states, are they going to be free states like these ones in the north? Or are they going to allow slavery? Because by this time, the enslaved states versus the free states have hardened, right? Their boundaries have hardened pretty good. And again, this was one of the main issues in America. What do we do with Native Americans and their land? And what do we do with the expansion of slavery? So what do you all do when you have a seemingly intractable, what's the word? A problem that you can't fix, like even with your sweetie or your brother or your partner or your family member?
You're gonna rebel.
You can rebel, but what do you do before you rebel? What do you try to do when you have a problem with your somebody?
Get out. Have a Conversation.
Have a conversation, and hopefully you'll come up with a
Solution?
compromise. And the old joke is a compromise is a solution that both sides hate equally, right? Isn't that what a compromise is? So the compromise that the US came up with in 1820, as the United States was expanding west, after France sold this whole Midwest to the United States without asking any Native Americans, by the way. So the northern states and the southern states came up with a compromise and said, you know what, this blue area, no slavery. This Missouri and Arkansas area, slavery is okay. So this was just a compromise that many folks knew, like, man, I hope it sticks together or else we're gonna have a civil war. When the Civil War exploded, it was a surprise to no one who was paying attention in the United States. Fast forward a generation, in 1844, a Democrat by the name of James Polk ran for president on one issue and one issue only. And he even said, if I am elected president, I will promise to get the Mexican territory, and I promise just to remain for one term. And he did both those promises. So by the end of his presidency, we had conquered, earned, got the Mexican territory, and he was out. And during his presidency was kind of one of the heights of this notion of manifest destiny, that Americans are entitled, right, by God to have this territory from sea to shining sea. So before starting a war, Polk offered Mexico $30 million, and I think Ashley brought this up earlier. Mexico refused, so Polk sent troops to the border in order to incite violence, and sure, the Mexican-American War erupted shortly thereafter. The war did not last long at all. Remember, at this time, Texas had also rebelled against Mexico. Americans in California had declared the California Republic under the Bear Flag Revolt. So there were spot fires happening everywhere in the American West at this time. The war lasted 21 months. Mexican forces won no battles. But now one of the big decisions Americans had was, heck, some Americans said, you know what, let's take all of Mexico. Let's just do it. Why do you think Americans didn't take all of Mexico? Wouldn't that have solved a lot of immigration problems now? Why do you think the US whipped Mexico in the war? Why not just annex all of Mexico? Some Americans were saying that.
I remember reading it was specifically because there weren't enough white people living there.
Yeah. Why didn't America want to take all of Mexico? Well, because Mexicans live there. I kid you not, please don't believe me. So in the Senate, it's our US senators who debate this sort of thing, right? It's their job to come up with these treaties with other nations. So in the very heated debate after the Mexican-American War ended, Senator John Clark said the following about incorporating more of Mexico. He said, to incorporate such a disjointed people and degraded masses into even a limited participation with our social and political rights would be fatally destructive to the institution of our country. Here's the kicker, in case you didn't know, like, whoa, is he gonna get all racist here? Oh yeah. There is a moral pestilence to such a people which is contagious. Mexicans have a leprosy that will destroy. Isn't that horrible? Yep. And I can give you examples, or many examples of these Senate debates. If you want to read some of the minutes of the Senate debates, I'm happy to send them to you. So does it make sense now? All right, I have to show you a Donald Trump Miss Universe pageant just for a little side commercial break. So the Miss Universe pageant in 2007 was held in Mexico City. And if y'all haven't been to Mexico City, I highly recommend you go after this COVID thing. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. However, these were the finalists: Venezuela, Korea, Brazil, US, and Japan. These were the finalists for Miss America, Miss Universe. It's kind of weird we call it Miss Universe. Shouldn't it be called Miss World, right? Anyway, so you know what happened to this young woman, Miss USA, as she was walking down, what's it called, the stage, the runway thing? When she was walking down the runway thing, her high heel broke and she slipped and fell. Oh, and you know what Mexican audience members did? They laughed, the whole place just exploded in laughter at this poor young woman's fall. Well, how do you explain that? As a historian, many Mexicans still have this open wound about losing half of their territory, and in addition, being treated when they go to Mexico, either as visitors or as migrants, as second-class citizens. So again, this is still the wound of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and how Mexicans are treated here in the United States is still, it's still an open wound. Okay. Hey, y'all doing? We have about 7 minutes to go. Is that work? Is that good? Any questions? All right. I'm starting to smell smoke where I live. Not good. So the Treaty of Guadalupe. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ashley.
Oh, I hit unmute.
Okay. So in exchange for $15 million and getting whooped, the Mexican Senate, right, ceded us this territory here. Okay. And then Texas agreed to be part of the United States as well a little earlier. So this Mexican cession. However, Article 9 of the Mexican cession, I've already read this to you, right, in the California lecture, but let me just read it to you again if you've read the California lecture. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed the 80,000 Mexicans living here, quote, they shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property and secured in the free exercise of their religion without restriction. Yadira, what does that look like to you? What are Mexicans going to enjoy under Article 9 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo?
Nothing at all.
No, according to this right here.
Oh,
Promise Mexicans.
that's a lie. To me, it means that it was written in there that they would be respected and they would be seen as pretty much citizens.
Mm-hmm.
That any Hispanic person that fell into those territories that were now considered part of the U.S.
Yeah, so on paper, it looks great, right? On paper, it's like, oh my gosh, this is going to be like kumbaya. Everybody's just going to get along and have potlucks and big parties in the park, right? Yep. However, one of the other big issues, are these areas going to be free states or slave states? Even Ulysses S. Grant, you might have heard him. Ulysses S. Grant helped defeat the Confederacy during the U.S. Civil War. He's a guy from Ohio. Ulysses S. Grant was against the war. This is before he fought in the Civil War, of course. He said, the occupation, separation, and annexation of Texas were from the inception of the movement to its final consummation, a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed for the American Union. In other words, Ulysses S. Grant, a former US general and president, said, you know what? Slave states want the Mexican territories to become places where slavery can expand, right? If you look at the American map of the expansion of slavery from 1790 on top to 1860 below, is just expanded rapidly in the South. And while you might think, wait a minute, if these areas here in Utah and New Mexico, you can't grow cotton in Arizona. Well, they even argued that, well, hey, you can have slaves used for mining interests, right? Or agricultural interests or other things. So they wanted to bring their slave economy west. Many Americans were against the war because they respected Mexican sovereignty, like Abraham Lincoln, John Quincy Adams, Henry David Thoreau. But they were especially against the Mexican-American War because they knew that this might lead to the expansion of slavery, right? And Lincoln, Adams, and Thoreau were not down with that. So what happens in 1850 after we acquire these territories? Yet another compromise to avoid a revolution. Like Ashley said, what do you do when you get in a fight with somebody? Well, you revolt or you make an agreement, a compromise. Co-promise, it comes from co-promise. So in this compromise, the green areas, no slaves. The orangey areas are brown, yes slave, and the striped areas vote on it. So what this is going to lead to is many slave interests try to move as fast as they can into these territories to establish slavery and then create a state and then enshrine it in the Constitution. This changes by 1860 when the Civil War changes everything. Okay. Turning the page, our final little chapter, Mexican politics in the early years. Here's our friend, Antonio Lopez Santa Anna, a guy from Veracruz, a wealthy landowner, former muleteer. So what marked Mexican politics in the 1800s? Wars, internal strife, internal rebellions, folks fighting for power. All right, whether it was the War of Independence, the war between Texas and Mexico that you're going to watch the film about, whether it's the Mexican-American War, the Mexican Civil War of the 1860s, or France attempted, Napoleon III of France attempted to retake Mexico and make it part of a colony. So in other words, Mexico was going through a lot of internal turmoil as to who's going to control this vast, this very regionally dispersed and very rich area. And this caused a lot of literal war deaths, territorial infrastructure destruction, displacements and migrations. In the 1800s, many Mexicans migrated north to escape. They were war refugees. And Mexico lost half of its territory to the US. Another data point about the political chaos was now that the Spanish crown was gone, right, and many of the Spanish leaders of the different political states literally left Mexico, there was this power vacuum. And during this time, what did I say? The United States had 9 presidents. Mexico had 35 presidents and 5 different constitutions at this time. It was just total chaos. And I think I told you, I started this little chat when Ashley, I think, mentioned about Santa Anna, Antonio Lopez Santa Anna. He was president for 11 different terms, one time for only 20 minutes, because he didn't actually like being president. He liked the process of becoming president, but he didn't like the boring governance of doing it. And one final story about Santa Anna. In one battle, he lost his leg. And after he lost his leg, they officially buried his leg. They had a big old state funeral for it and everything, and all this pomp and weird, surreal circumstance around it. And then after he left the presidency and his enemies regained it, they dug up the leg and drug it through the streets of Mexico. All right, there's a little chapter in your movie about the Mexican-American War for you. So can you understand why Absolut Vodka, I think this is a Swedish company, correct me if I'm wrong. Absolut, is it Sweden?
Yeah.
So Absolut Vodka, the Swedish company, tried to increase its sales of vodka in Mexico with this ad in 2008. So after listening about the Mexican-American War, does that make sense? Because in this absolute world, Mexico has all their territory back. Okay, that is my lecture. Thank you for joining. Let me just